One of my core design principles is the idea of activity propagation, that the player should be able to create chains of activity rippling through the game. The main ways they will be able to propagate rotational activity is by the use of gears and belts. Here's my story of how I implemented them. Let's start with the gears. I first tried making a simple gear constraint. The gear constraint would have one purpose: to reach equilibrium where the rotational speed of one gear would equal the inverse of the other. If you want to set up one of these gear constraints yourself, you can likely just ask ChatGPT and you will get a very simple component to use. But constraints like these have one caveat. We need to know which objects we are connecting. For my game, that is kind of problematic. I want the player to be able to pick up a gear and place it somewhere else. I also like the idea of gears being able to move freely and dynamically connecting. To support this, we would need a reaction to when gears are touching each other and dynamically connect or disconnect them. The more I was talking to ChatGPT, the problem just grew and grew. I remembered a video I watched about Zelda. They were talking about how instead of animating stuff programmatically or by hand, they relied more on the physics system, and suddenly they saw many of their bugs go away. Now, I know this isn't exactly what they meant, but it inspired me to take it one step further and rely entirely on the physics system. And I was genuinely surprised how well it worked. Originally, I was planning to create colliders that also looked like gears, making a circle, then a bunch of rectangles for teeth. But I decided to first make a prototype using a circle. I also set a custom physics material to the gears so they have maximum friction. And already with the circular colliders, it looked really good. There's no visible slip. And I love how the high friction of the gear makes it react to the character. In fact, I love this so much that I forgot to actually check if the usual scenario worked, and it turns out it didn't. Somehow the physics engine seemed to ignore two objects that are adjacent unless there is any linear momentum involved. The way I fixed this was that instead of having the hinge joint on the gear and hinging it to the ground, I hinged it on top of an axle. This axle I then joined with the ground using a spring joint. This allows the axle and in turn the gear to have small micro movement. I tried a whole bunch of different joint types, and eventually I found that the target joint was the best one. I believe this is because the target joints have a target distance of 0, whereas the spring joint has a built-in minimum target distance. And here we have it. Look what amazing gears. And they automatically connect and disconnect without us having to write any sort of connection code. Beautiful. Gear looks good. Let's talk belts. There's actually a preserved belt-driven factory in my hometown called Göteborgs Remfabrik. And what did the factory make? Well, you guessed it, belts. People clearly already played Factorio in the early 1900s. What I love with these kinds of factories is that you can kind of grasp how they work just by looking at things. And I guess that's what I want to give with my game as well. I want something that the player can feel like they're in control of and they understand. So let's start with implementing belts. The first thing I did was enable objects to be stacked on top of each other. If you stack something on top of a gear, I joined it together with the gear's axle. Do you remember the constraint I talked about before? The problem with the constraint was that we need to explicitly say which objects we are connecting. Well, for belt, that problem disappears. For belts, we will explicitly say which 2 points we are connecting. The only difference with the belt is that we don't want to inverse the rotation. In real life, we would sometimes cross the belt to inverse rotations, but I'm leaving that out for now. If we now connect the belt from one gear to the other, we can see that momentum is transferred across the distance. Easy peasy. But it doesn't look too clear why momentum is being transferred. It would be nice if there could be at least some movement to indicate that they are connected. So I figured we could at least scroll a texture along the lines that connects the two shafts. I created a slightly noisy texture, which I repeat along the lines. And using a scrolling texture shader, I update the scroll speed to be a multiple of the shaft's rotation speed. Here's how it looks. Finally, for some depth, we should also add some shadows. I also added a collider on the belts so that they would keep small enemies like the blob away. Now let's look at some fun stuff we can do with the gears and belts. I also added the ability to stack other objects on top of gears. Here I'm stacking the ice dragon statue on top of the gear. This allows the ice dragon statue to be rotated, even in smoother increments than was able before. There's also the simple hand crank that I created to manually rotate the gears with the mouse. I find it a bit funny, even though it's very finicky to use right now. I just like that you're kind of manually using your arm to make the motion necessary for things to rotate. It's almost like it's fun that it's annoying to use. And finally, I added crushing damage to the gears, so that they damage small enemies that get stuck in the gaps. And that's all from me. Comment if you have any cool game idea that would work well with these gears and belts, and see you next time!